Good morning. I'm Oliver Gao. I'm the director of Cornell Systems Engineering Program, and we'll be interviewing with our ERA Systems seminar speakers, which we call System Conversations. So today we are very glad and honored to have Dr. Brian O'Neill, and who is an NCAR senior scientist, and he leads the Integrated Assessment Modeling Group within the Terrestrial Science section. He also leads the NCAR's Climate and Human System Project, and also co-chairs the Societal Dimensions Working Group of NCAR's climate model, the Community Earth Systems models. So all these things are of great interest, not only to me, but also to a wide audience here at Cornell. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for taking time to visit with us. Of course, actually, Nathan and I, we have been talking about bringing you here a long time ago. So now you're able to come. So, and I was reading your bio. I was so impressed. And I really believe this is really a very good reflection of what we mean by systems. Right? I think you have a degree, in applied science, and also you have a degree in, I think, was that atmospheric science or?
Earth systems.
Earth systems.
Speaking of systems,
yeah,
yes.
Earth systems.
Earth system science.
Yeah, Earth system science. And then I think you had working experience with universities.
Yes.
And with the Environmental Defense Fund, and with EASA, and all these different places, you led a lot of very important initiatives. And not to mention, you had wonderful books, on this. I think the book on the topic of population and climate change. So looking at these things, maybe I think not only me, but our audience will be interested in knowing more about you yourself and your research. Would you like to get started by introducing yourself, your research, whatever you would like us to know?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll frame this around the idea of systems and what that means to me and what kind of systems I work on. And so maybe starting, as you mentioned, my PhD degree is in Earth system science. And so systems is in the title, and it had a specific meaning, which in Earth systems is, as opposed to studying a specific element of the Earth system, for example, the atmosphere, which lots of people do, great work, focus on atmospheric science, for example, or on oceanography, or on terrestrial science, land, plants, and soils, and so on. Earth system science aims to study how the Earth works as a whole, which involves the interactions among all of these elements. And some aspects of how the Earth works requires or involves all of those aspects. So climate is a great example of that. The climate is an outcome of the interactions between the atmosphere, the ocean, the land surface, ice sheets, and so on. So if you want to study climate, then you need to know something about many different elements of the system. Another example that's related to climate is biogeochemistry, what's called biogeochemical cycles. So for example, carbon, people who focus on the role of carbon in the Earth system, in the climate system, but also in other aspects. And carbon moves around from the atmosphere to the ocean, to the land plants, to the soils. So if you want to understand how carbon moves around the Earth system and how it affects outcomes like climate, you need to know about lots of different elements of the system. So that, to me, coming in was the attraction of a system science, in this case, Earth system science, which is understanding some, larger, bigger picture outcome of a system, Earth system, that involved many interacting elements. Now, since then, since my graduate days, my focus has been basically on adding an additional very large and complicated element to that system, which is humans and society. Another thing that interacts with the oceans, the atmospheres, plants, soils, and so on, is society itself. in our use of energy, land use, but formulation of policies, changes in technology, growth in populations, all of these things make up an equally or even more complicated system itself of human society, but that also interacts with the Earth system. And so my focus in my work has been on trying to improve our understanding of how those interactions work and how they may influence future risks related to climate change in particular, but also how we might take advantage of them to create opportunities to deal with those risks.
Since your PhD, you have been doing this Earth system science, and then you expanded it to even include more effects related to humans and society after your after you graduate and in your real work. And I think while as a system person, you are looking at these Earth systems from a holistic point of view, and you see the key challenges, and you probably even realize the time urgency for the society to take actions, right? However, in our society, and not many people are actually, they are kind of taking this kind of systems view, right? While you, through your research, and we want to push forward this kind of agenda, we want more people to know about this. So from this point of view, and looking at the history of Earth, right? Even looking at the history of Earth since human beings kind of stood on the surface of Earth until now, what do you see in anything we did right to the Earth, anything we did wrong to the Earth? Where did we come from, and where are we heading?
Well, I think I'm a little bit biased based on the kinds of topics that I work on, but I do think currently and in the coming decades, coping with society's global impacts on the Earth system is a primary challenge that we're facing now, and one that we have just come to terms with and realized is an issue. I think before the last, I would say, half century or so, even the idea that human society as a whole had a big enough effect on the environment around us that it might have global consequences was not something that was in sort of our consciousness or our recognition. And maybe around the middle of the 20th century came to realize, there are things that we can do that could affect us globally. Part of that, I think, was tied to actually nuclear weapons, and that the introduction of nuclear weapons, among other things, introduced the idea that, hey, maybe like a very large-scale nuclear war could actually have global consequences. And that, at least introduced the idea that a human effect on global conditions was possible. So in a similar way, global climate change would not have the same kinds of consequences as a nuclear war, but in the sense that they could be of global extent, was added to the kinds of global concerns we might have. In addition, we've now are grappling with biodiversity challenges, land use, that maybe not by itself is a global issue, but it is global in extent. It occurs in so many areas around the world, we consider it a global issue. Water, scarcity and quality, similarly. And that, I think, is part of a long-term historical evolution where, at least in terms of the ways that human society considered its impact on the environment, for many centuries and thousands of years was local. Right. And so, this is something new, relatively new, if we consider, the 50 to 100-year time scale as something that's recent. And so I think that's something that we're going to continue to grapple with, and that's not going to change. I think that, as we look into the long-term future, say 100, 200 years into the future, climate change as an issue is not going to go away. I imagine it will fundamentally transform. We're currently focused on how can we moderate or somehow lessen or ameliorate some of the effects that we anticipate from climate change, whether from reducing emissions or adapting. Of course, it's impossible to know what the world's going to be like in 100 years and certainly 200 years, but my personal assumption is that by that time scale, we're going to be choosing our climate. And so it will be a different type of choice, a different type of decision and issue, but it will be in the same category. Humans interact with the Earth system, has global scale effects. As we learn more increasingly about climate change and how the climate system works, I think the opportunities or possibilities for deliberately modifying the climate will grow, and that'll be a new era of human interactions with the climate system. But that's a ways down the road, I believe.
So, but you can see that it seems like you are saying that it's really within the hand of us, human beings. Mm-hmm. So how can we help them make the right choice? For example, for our kids, when we educate our kids, we really, as parents, while we're trying to help them to learn English, math, social studies, but the key thing we want to teach them is to how to make the right choices. Right, so now in your eyes as a climate scientist, while doing all this consistent modeling, and then when you look at the human society and the population, somehow the behavior of the population is more like a child. And you know where we should go while the population is not necessarily heading where we're going. So in that sense, looking back, what do you see as the key failures that either at an urban scale to even to the global scale and human beings as a collective body, what are some key failures when you do all this modeling and we're trying to provide insights about where we should go in the future? Do you have a regret to say, human beings, if we had done this 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that would have put us in a much better position? So what kind of key failure now we look back, you identify, and then what would be the solutions that in your mind from out of your research that you would recommend not only to the government, not only to the IPCC, UN, but also to the general public?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think that for many of these issues, it's hard to identify early on as failures, not successfully anticipating some of the negative effects of new technologies or new behaviors. Mm-hmm. That would have been probably too much to ask 100 years ago, as the consumption of fossil fuels grew and emissions of CO2 grew. It's not that no one had any idea that might eventually cause climate change that might have its own risks and create some problems. There was some idea about that, but there really wasn't enough known that I think we could look back and say, yes, in the 1920s or something, people should have known better, and I don't see how that could be the case. Maybe somewhat more recently in the climate issue, yes, we've probably known enough for a couple decades now to start taking some precautionary action to hedge our bets against the future. And one might see that as a failure. However, there's still a lot to learn about the climate issue. We understand some of the risks. Others still have quite large uncertainties on them. You know, my personal belief is we should be doing more to reduce emissions and head off some of the risks of climate change than we are currently doing. However, it is unclear to me, you know, exactly what amount of climate change is going to be too much for society to handle. And there's lots of trade-offs to think about in there as we're also trying to increase the pace of development around the world and still lift lots of people out of poverty, where energy and food production and so on is a big part of that. And there's been great progress made in those areas, but there's still a ways to go. I think one important approach or factor that is going to be important in dealing with these problems in the future, and it's the same for any problem that has a scientific component, is to recognize and act on the fact that these aren't just scientific problems, and the solutions or the process of making a choice, as we were talking about before, choosing what to do about it, is not a scientific question, strictly speaking.
That's right.
Science is important to it. It's fundamental to say, what do we know? What can we say about the risks? But then in deciding what to do about it, there are many factors that come into play about, you know, and most fundamentally, human values. What do we care about? And different people have different values. Different parts of the world have different development situations. It's much different if you're a highly industrialized, relatively well-off country thinking about what should we do about the climate issue versus a relatively low-income developing country that has a totally different set of priorities. The right choice to make on how to approach the climate issue is not the same there. Even within a country, different people have different perspectives, different values. How much do you care about the condition of the world 50 years from now or 100 years from now relative to today, or 5 years from now? And that's going to vary across people. So in approaching these issues, we have to recognize that this is not a question of scientists work out the right answer and hand it down and then somebody implements the right solution. It has to be a conversation, and that has to involve many segments of the public, many different countries, and in the research world, many different disciplines. It's not just straight science, but it's philosophy, it's economics, it's the humanities, and all of these are involved in understanding what is the problem that we're trying to address, and how do we evaluate options for addressing it, and how do we make decisions about it.
I got 2 points I just want to kind of reiterate. And at the beginning, we were trying to answer my question, and I totally agree with you, your answer. I think you were trying to probably kind of pointing to that it was not necessarily a failure, but it was a fact that caused us onto this kind of track was because of the limit of knowledge at that time. We were doing something, we were thinking that we were doing the right things, but because of the lacking of the far ahead knowledge, right? So what we're doing, what that means for climate, and even at that time, people didn't, 100 to 200 years, people didn't even think about that. So of course, when we think about knowledge, and that actually relates to us, universities, scientists, we are supposed to produce knowledge. And not only knowledge for today, but knowledge for tomorrow. So now if you look back, and with this kind of, it's not necessarily a lesson, however, what happened in terms of climate during the past few hundreds of years, and look in the future, and if we rethink about our education system and our scientific research system, how is it, okay, 100 years, 200 years ago, we were limited by our knowledge. That's why we did something that did not necessarily turn out to be good for the climate. But now we realize that it was a knowledge limit. So now if we want to prepare, and prepare not ourselves, but also our future students, what do you see any needs or challenge for our higher education system as well as for our scientific research community?
Yes, but I do think we've made progress already in this area. Maybe a lesson you could take from a history of the side of two sides of the coin is that new developments, often in technology, but they can be developments in other areas as well, that will have benefits but also consequences, and some consequences that may not be easy to anticipate. That is a lesson that we have probably learned to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so that the idea that when a new technology or a new way of doing things is introduced, that we should also think, okay, this seems great, but let's take some time and really think about what some non-obvious, unanticipated consequences might be, so that we don't make the same kind of mistakes we've made in the past. I think to some degree we do that now. Maybe not quite as much as we should, and we need to continue to do that. From the systems perspective, a piece of that is understanding that these consequences that we might not anticipate can happen because of the systems nature of the world, how the interconnections in the world have grown or strengthened over time. I guess say an example that has to do with partly with transportation that you work on is, for example, in infectious disease, that the potential for an outbreak in one area to spread rapidly and jump large distances because of the global transportation system and how interconnected it is something that was not the case, 50, 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It is the case now, and is a kind of risk that we need to be concerned about now in a way that we didn't have to in the past. And so bringing this systems perspective and the interconnectedness among populations, among economies, is very important. It reminds me, I had a conversation with Natalie this morning, and she was telling me it's a project that they're working on similar in crop diseases that are spread by spores that can be transported through the atmosphere, and then understanding, well, how might climate change affect atmospheric transport, which could change the way, maybe exacerbate the way that crop diseases spread from one region of the world to another, because they get transported in new ways. This is probably not something that would have occurred to us, a century ago, but that we now have enough experience to say, hey, this is something we can think about and investigate now, because we have new knowledge of the climate system and atmospheric circulation and so on, that we can put to use in this way.
I think that's definitely a very good point. And I kind of combining earlier, you also mentioned, I really appreciate kind of you, because of your education and your training and also your working experience, you can easily pick up, you can easily have a common language with economists, and you can easily have a conversation with atmospheric scientists, because the way you have really a well-rounded knowledge structure that makes you see the need and the value of integrating all these disciplines together. But unfortunately, kind of people like you are not many. For example, that's why I was talking about our higher education. I remember that I would remember when I was learning history, the reason why human society has been progressing so fast in recent decades or recent 100 years, because we are now becoming more and more specialized. Specialization kind of helps efficiency. Such like when we, education, like we have electrical engineering, we have computer science, and we are training all these kind of people in these different separate disciplines in such a nice way so that they are so good in doing the thing they are doing. However, when it's outside of their scope, they either don't know or they don't have any interest. So for example, in the transportation field, nowadays we're talking about these autonomous driven vehicles, right? Mm-hmm. And people are talking about, of course, people are excited about this Uber model, like, right? And all these things, new business models or technologies are happening. And imagine if like a car engineer thinking about just the sensor network within a car and trying to improve it, make it better. And then versus you looking at what would be the impact of all these things to the society, and how in our future education, how do we address these kind of gaps? Because otherwise, if these things are not interconnected in a very holistic way, like you look at these things, and it could be the case that, for example, for civil engineers, we build roads and we build transportation systems. And a lot of time for civil engineers, when they build these things, not only for the engineers, but also for the decision makers, they are pursuing efficiency. Whether it's physical efficiency, get you from point A to point B in the shortest time, or it's economic efficiency, to get these things done in the most cost-effective way. But you can see that the environmental dimension, the climate dimension seldom get into their decision equation. Right? So that way, like the better they are doing, they are optimizing all their decisions. But it could be the case that the better they are doing, the worse it turns out for the climate, for the environment, for the public health. So that's why I think also you mentioned earlier the human factors. You said that it's actually to cope with this challenge, it's not only about scientists. You kind of these models tell people it's really humans, and you mentioned the keyword value, how their value system is operating. This kind of reminds me, the system engineering, as I mentioned, it has a deep root in military applications. So system engineering as a discipline got developed a lot since after World War I and World War II. And actually, Manhattan Project was one of the most successful system project in terms of its operation and achieving its goal, right? So, however, nowadays, a lot of challenge for climate challenge, it's not a military challenge. It's more kind of what we call like human-centered, social technical systems. So the Cornell system program, while we cover this kind of, we aerospace and military usage, nuclear, but system engineering program at Cornell has been strategically positioning itself to target what we call commercial systems and a human-centered complex system. That's why I'm excited, like your work is really a very good match of this commercial or this human-centered complex system. Now, speaking of human value, do you see any hope to somehow, through the work of generations of scientists, to change the value towards the way we feel it's a healthy and direct value system?
Well, I don't, I am optimistic that we, meaning sort of society in general, is going to cope with the global challenges that we're facing. Let's, take climate in particular. I believe we are going to, but that doesn't mean that we're going to do it in a way that any particular person, scientist or non-scientist today, thinks is their own personal preferred way to get through this. And I also don't think that it is necessarily the case that any individual scientist or scientists in general view on what the right response to the climate issue should be has any reason to prefer that than from someone else. I think it's important that decisions and choices and personal opinions on the climate issue or on any other challenge are well informed by our scientific understanding of the issue. That's important. But that's only one component that goes into deciding, given what we know, what is a best approach today. So, I think that we kind of easily slide into the idea that scientists might have a preferred decision relative to someone else, because you can generally assume that scientists will have a better understanding of what we know about the issue. And that may be true. So maybe in that one fairly limited sense, that's something that you may be able to count on if you're listening to a scientist on the issue say, here's what I think we should be doing. Well, probably they understand the science of the issue. But that by itself is not enough. If a non-scientist can understand enough about the climate issue to have a well-informed opinion on what society should do about it, that is equally valid to whatever the scientist thinks we should do about it. Because in the end, once they both have sort of a grasp of the basics of the issue, beyond that, they're equally valid opinions, and they may differ quite a lot. I did want to come back to, you talked a bit before about expertise, and so for example, I have some expertise in a variety of disciplines that allows me to interact with people in those different areas. And so I don't want to take too much time out of the conversation on it, but I do think it's an important topic for training and education, and it is not an easy one. It is not straightforward. So given the value of systems thinking and the value it can bring to lots of different problems, how should people be trained in graduate schools in order to do that? And I, for example, often tell people, students included, when they ask me about this and my own background, is that my kind of background and range of different topics that I work on works for me and works in certain settings, in certain types of groups, but you don't want too many of me running around. And the reason is that in order to tackle any particular problem, we need lots of different kinds of people. We need people with narrow disciplinary expertise. And if one of the things that produces that narrow expertise is, for that particular person, a lack of interest in other areas, fine. If that's what it takes, that's what it takes. We need people who are really just great atmospheric scientists or just a great economist. We do need also to be able to put these fields together in order to understand what is an important interdisciplinary question to ask, how do we address it scientifically, and how to interpret the results of any analysis. What does it mean, and what new questions does it lead to? That can come from a single person, where you may say, okay, that one person knows enough about these different fields to play that role. Mm-hmm. And often that's the role I end up in personally. But it also can come from a team of people with expertise in particular areas who also have enough interest and ability to talk across disciplines to make those connections. And so for students who may have any, either narrow or broad or someplace in the middle kinds of interests, there are roles to play in the larger enterprise of sort of science as an institution addressing these issues. I do think at the moment, with the emergence of so many systems-related problems, that we could use more people who can more effectively connect across disciplines, work across disciplines, understand each other, and be interested to do that. I agree that we could use more of them. But I don't see the long-term goal as everybody doing that. Because it's fundamental in the end. And even my own research group, we can agree on an interdisciplinary question and then decide on what to do. And then when we get to that point, okay, now we want to do something. We need a demographer who really knows demography to do a piece of the problem, an economist to do a piece of the problem, a climate scientist to do a piece of it, and to bring it together. And we. I don't see that changing. We're always going to need disciplinary expertise as well.
I really appreciate your broad view, and in the meantime, you have this open mind, and also probably seem like if we can optimize, the society should have certain numbers of people that with a system view, but also like some kind of pyramid or something, right? People with different skill set. So if we talk about these general issues, and I'm really interested in your talk, if we can pick a little bit before you talk.
Sure.
So, this climate change, it's really even in the society. Some people believe it, some people don't believe it. So it's kind of different. Of course, one thing is, as scientists, you want to quantify it, right? So that is quantification will help people either better convince them or help us test some hypotheses. And a lot of times, when we think about temperature, right? So, 2 weeks ago, we had a temperature of 60 Fahrenheit, and now we are like, 10 or, 20. So usually we think about, okay, 10 Celsius or, 20 kind of degrees of change. It's kind of very normal. So in this climate change context, as your title of the talk implies, does half a degree of global warming, does it matter or not? Mm-hmm. You are an expert. You've been doing this model. You've been doing this research. I think you have this BRACE project, which is the benefit of reduced anthropogenic climate change. So do you want to talk, more about these projects and, what you find out in these projects? And I would like to go now kind of to your specific disciplinary expertise. We want to drive a little bit depth.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this was two related projects. One is called BRACE, it's the acronym you spelled out, and then one is called BRACE 1.5. It's kind of a derivative of the larger project that's a little more narrowly focused, but the general goal was to add to the scientific literature on what do we understand about how climate change risks, impacts on people, society, ecosystems, how does that depend on how much climate change we end up with? And that's important kind of in the bigger picture framing of the climate issue, which you can think of, at least in broad terms, as sort of a cost-benefit problem. Mm-hmm. We can reduce the amount of climate change in the future, we know, by reducing emissions from emissions of carbon, other greenhouse gases, and that's going to have a cost. It's going to cost something to do. And the question is, what do we get for that? What's the benefit? And the benefit, in principle, is that you reduce the future impacts that climate change will cost. You'll have reduced risk in the future. Mm-hmm. And it is the case in the scientific literature that we have lots more understanding, many more studies on the cost part, how much would it cost to reduce emissions, than on the impact side. And that is not the case if you just count papers in the scientific literature. There's a very large impacts literature. It is tougher to tie that impacts literature to levels of climate change. It's just harder at the moment, given the way studies have been done, to say, well, if we have 3 degrees of warming, here are the risks. If we have 2.5, here's the risks. If we have 2. So there are a number of studies that are attempting to do that more systematically and clearly. And the BRACE studies were aimed at exactly that, is taking a couple of well-defined climate scenarios for future climate change with different levels of climate change, and then using lots of different models of impacts in different areas, health, agriculture, energy use, and so on, to look at if we reduce climate change and we get less of it in the future, how much do the impacts change? How much do those risks go down? And to quantify that, to help inform ultimately decisions about, well, what level of climate change would be a good one to aim for in the future, balancing these costs and benefits. So that was the goal. The BRACE study used two particular climate future scenarios with somewhat higher levels of climate change. The BRACE 1.5 focused specifically on, can we tell the difference, meaning can we, when we project future impacts of climate change, do we really get different answers if we have 2 degrees of warming or 1.5 degrees of warming? Mm-hmm. And that's important because those are two policy goals that are currently on the table right now as part of the recent Paris Agreement. And there have been many fewer studies of those particular relatively low levels of climate change in the future. So that's what we were aiming at is, so what can we say about that?
Yeah, I think that's, as you mentioned, a lot of decision making, you care about like what is the benefit and what is the cost and this benefit cost ratio. So with you're talking about 1.5 versus 2.0, Celsius of difference. So I don't know where your current study is for this project, but did you find out, so does this half degree make a significant difference in both the benefit side and also the cost side? And if it does it have very significant geographic variability? So mean that a half degree difference, it means much more for these areas, these countries, and however it means a lot less cost for some other areas.
We did find some different. I mean, our answer was that we got mixed results. For some types of impacts, yes, you can clearly anticipate a difference in consequences between these two levels of climate change. In other cases, the difference seems quite small, and in others, the uncertainties at the moment are too large to tell. The answer would be, we don't know.
That's right.
I should say, as kind of a caveat, though, that our particular study, the BRACE 1.5 study, looked at a limited set of impact outcomes in a few sectors. So agriculture, some exposure to extreme climate events, heat waves, heavy precipitation, things like that, and energy use, sort of climate-related energy use. In general, though, for the climate change problem as an issue, of course, there's a much wider range of impacts that matter. Sea level rise is actually a key outcome that was really one of the original drivers for the international policy process of saying, maybe we should think about trying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, not 2. Part of that was really driven by sea level rise, or some other ecological impacts on coral reefs, for example. Critical impact outcomes that really drive this question that simply, because of the practical constraints of our project, were not part of the impact outcomes to evaluate. Mm-hmm. So that said, sort of understanding, we're just looking at a piece of the problem, and other people are looking at other pieces. I think at least some of the kinds of results that we found are generalizable. So, for example, something that you do see a difference in clearly is extreme events. So even though it may sound small, that a difference in the global average temperature of 2 or 1.5 degrees, they're pretty similar, they're only a half degree difference. This actually does translate into meaningful differences in the frequency and intensity of heat waves, for example, or some measures of precipitation, some measures of drought in some regions. And now it's another question. This is part of the systems idea, right? That's a climate outcome. So
that's right. Heat
waves change, drought changes. But we're not interested in heat waves per se. What we're interested in is what consequences do those heat waves have for people or ecosystems? That's what we're interested in. Does that cause mortality? Does it contribute to the spread of infectious disease because mosquitoes can live in new places or not? Does it impact crop production and therefore affect the food system? So the work that we did showed, look, you can clearly see these differences in extreme events. We have less to go on and less evidence that those differences in extreme events are big enough to cause significant differences, say, in crop growth or in human mortality from heat waves. And that is ongoing work, but it demonstrates the links between the human and Earth system that are necessary to take into account in answering a risk question like this. But that is one example of a clear difference that 1.5 to 2 degrees makes. An example on the other side where the difference is not so clear is in evaluating consequences of climate change for the agricultural economy, let's say, as it affects people. So we looked at using a sort of linked set of climate and economic models. What happens to food prices? What are the impacts on food prices if you have 2 degrees of warming versus 1.5 degrees of warming? And in general, you would think before going in, well, probably we're going to be better off if we only have 1.5 degrees of warming rather than 2. We have less climate change, it would be make it less difficult to grow crops, and if it's less difficult, that is less costly to grow crops, then price outcomes will be better, have fewer impacts on people and food consumption. However, there's a number of uncertainties in that system. Mm-hmm. One is that in addition to just climate effects of heat and precipitation on crop growth, the level of atmospheric CO2 in the atmosphere just by itself, independent of its effect on climate, has consequences for crop growth and generally improves crop growth. That CO2 in the atmosphere is a kind of fertilizer for crops. So you have competing effects. With 2 degrees of warming, the reason that you have 2 degrees of warming rather than 1.5 is you have more atmospheric CO2 in the air. And so that is partially at least a benefit. Maybe that offsets the climate effect. Also, there's a number of uncertainties when you get to the human part of the system. How responsive are prices to changes in the conditions under which you're growing crops? If it gets tougher to grow crops and more costly, how much does that affect prices? International trade is an important aspect of that. If you have a particularly bad climate outcome in one region, what impact is that going to have on prices? Well, if there's no international trade, the impact will probably be big. Your production goes down, prices go up. Another outcome is trade works well. So if your production goes down, you import more food. Now your price still probably goes up, but probably not as much. So in order to evaluate this question of what is the risk of climate change to future agriculture, you have to account for, well, what does society look like? Does the trade system work well? You get one answer. Trade system doesn't work well, you get a different answer. And so our results were, given these uncertainties both on climate and CO2 effects on production, how the economy responds to that and produces price changes, we can't actually tell. You can actually end up better off with a little bit less climate change because you've got a smaller climate impact. You can end up a little worse off because you have less CO2, and so you're not getting as much benefit from higher CO2 levels. And in either case, the trade system and how well it works can flip you from a benefit to a net cost of having less climate change. So that's an example where the system dynamics are sort of complicated enough and not well known enough to be able to tell now that a 0.5 degree of warming less will make a difference in one direction or another.
you list all these different, so many factors, and each factor with all, so much uncertainty in that. And I noticed that you've been leading groups developing this kind of IAM, integrated assessment model, and also you've been leading the group develop this CEMS, right? So this what they call this, I think, community Earth systems models. As we can see that these models are going to take input, and input will be kind of translated from the scenarios. And I noticed one other contribution you made to the scientific community, I think you lead a lot of effort in generating and also I think designing those scenarios.
Right.
Given that many factors, given their uncertainty, I'm really amazed how in the end you make a decision. Let's model these scenarios. And I feel it's really something in between techniques as well as art, right? So so in this kind of scenario design and selection, how did you make the decision, and what kind of guiding principles did you apply when you let's do this?
That's a good question, and it took a long time to make that decision and then produce what we produced. The basic problem is that the future, as we know, is highly uncertain, and the future means both the future of the climate system, but as we talked about, for understanding risks, that also depends on the future of society and how well off people are and how many of them we are, and so on. So if you want to evaluate the climate change issue, which requires looking fairly into the long-term future, what do you do? Because the uncertainty is high. There are a number of different approaches that people take in the scientific world to dealing with it. The one that has most often been taken in the climate change issue is this scenario approach, where you define ahead of time a relatively small number of alternative visions of how the future may unfold in very broad terms. And by small number, that might be 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. Not 50, not 100. Although one can easily imagine any number of possible futures. And the reason for doing that is that you don't want to just design one particular future scenario which you think is the most likely outcome, because we have lots of evidence from these kinds of exercises in the past that people are very unsuccessful at coming close to getting the right answer in designing a single most likely future. And also from a decision point of view, if you design a single scenario and then you say, okay, so given that best guess about how the future is going to unfold, what's the best policy to take? Well, then you design a policy that works well if you're right about the way the future unfolds. And if it doesn't, if you're not right, that policy probably doesn't work well. So the idea is to develop several alternative futures that span a wide range of possibilities, so that you can use them to sort of test policies, responses that might work well kind of regardless of how the future turns out. But keeping in mind that we're human beings and we can only keep a few different things in our mind at one time, and so we limit the number of scenarios to a small number. So then, as you're asking, the question is, well, which ones, right? So the way we did it in this most recent round of scenarios that we developed, they're called the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, SSPs. It's the jargon for it. And these are the ideas that these get used across the scientific community by lots of different researchers, lots of different studies. And so they're important to design, because it's not just like for one paper that we're going to write, but it's for probably hundreds of papers that many people are going to write. And the idea was you need at the beginning to define, why are you doing this? Based on why are you doing this, what are the characteristics of the scenarios that they need to have in order to achieve your goal, and then design them. our conclusion was, okay, we're focusing this on climate change research primarily. And these are going to be used to characterize uncertainty in addressing two primary kinds of questions. One is, for any future level of climate change, how difficult or costly would it be to actually achieve? So on the emissions reduction side, how tough is it going to be to actually limit warming to 2 degrees or 3 degrees or so on? Second kind of question is, for any particular level of climate change, how tough is it going to be to cope with? How difficult will society find it to handle 2 degrees of warming or 3 degrees of warming? So given that, we decided, well, we need scenarios in which societal conditions, meaning population conditions, urbanization, economic growth, levels of inequality, governance, international cooperation, all of these factors, the trade system that we talked about before, that they follow trends that span a range of outcomes for how difficult it makes it for the world to either cope with climate change or to reduce it. So we called these challenges to adaptation and challenges to mitigation of climate change. So that was sort of our uncertainty range. We want a small number of scenarios that span different combinations. Oh, well, here's one where the world turns out to have conditions of population, economic growth, technological change, and so on, that make it relatively easy to reduce climate change and to deal with whatever climate change we end up with, or that both things turn out in a pessimistic way. It's hard to do either of those things, or that you get some combinations. Here's a world that, for some reason, is not too hard to cope with climate change, but would find it really difficult to avoid it in the first place. So that's how we kind of worked backwards from what question are we trying to address to what conditions. And then, of course, the trick was drawing on what do we know? What is the scholarship basis for what do we know about what is it? What elements of society make it hard to adapt? So from the adaptation literature, what makes it tough to adapt? So we drew on things like, well, governance turns out to be a big problem. If governance doesn't work well. In agriculture, your agricultural extension system, your ability to transmit new practices or new crop types, seed varieties, or so on to farmers to be able to adapt crops. If that doesn't work well, that's going to make it tough to adapt to climate change. If your trade system doesn't work well, that's going to make it difficult. Probably if population growth is too fast, you'll have lots to deal with for coping with the general increase in population and find it difficult. If people aren't well educated, if investments in education stall, for example, in developing countries today, that's going to make things tougher. And vice versa, if investments are really high in those areas, it may produce a world that's relatively resilient. So it was translating those, using scholarship on what we know about development trends and how they matter either to climate change adaptation or to mitigation, into cohesive, plausible, and different scenarios for how the future may unfold, and then quantify those to some degree. Not just say, well, here's one scenario in which education improves rapidly. What is rapidly? How much do we know about how fast investments in educational improvement turn into increases in school enrollment rates, which then turn into increases in the level of education for 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and so on down the line, projected into the future? People do that in the demography world. It's a whole field that you then need to bring in so that you're moving into a more well-grounded and quantitative space that allows you to produce, and the important part, plausible alternative futures, not just any alternative futures. So that's sort of the trick.
While you were talking and I was trying to interpret and summarize, and I feel kind of, given this kind of very complicated systems modeling, So one key is to have a very clear, focused targeted question in mind, and then you go from there, and then extends, of course, to the whole chain of different factors where seem like deciding on the scale and the granularity is really the artistic part.
Right.
Yeah, you design. I think this is very, very helpful, Brian. You kind of also for me, even though I do transplant air quality modeling, but I really didn't know much about this kind of climate model. Now I appreciate really the complexity and also, the technical challenge. And also, of course, I think the artistic part, combining all this from human factor to the scientific part. I think this is really helpful even for me personally to interpret this. I think given time, and I think I should probably let you go to your next meeting, even though I wanted to talk too much.
And as you can tell, I can talk about this stuff forever. So
and I'd love to listen to this. So thank you very much, Brian.
Thanks a lot, Oliver.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you.
Very interesting.
Yeah.